that's definitely worth preserving. If I look at the period under Franklin Roosevelt, I think that would be a great precedence on how an alliance had been established between the political class and the population against those kind of interests. And I think that should be the focus, rather than trying to mingle with, trying to tinker with the system and introducing a parliamentary system or not, things like that.
Your point is extremely well taken, and in fact, the other countries that suffered most severely in the financial crisis and whose behavior was the most extreme and egregious, Iceland and the United Kingdom, both have parliamentary systems. So you're absolutely right that a parliamentary system is not by itself a guarantee at all against this kind of behavior. It may well be that the desirability or lack of desirability of a particular electoral system is extremely historically contingent. So, yeah, you have a very good point.
Hi. I don't think there's a sentimental aversion in the U.S. to people being allowed to invest and take risks and be involved in complicated finances, but I think the thing now that scares me, and I think scares a lot of people, is the ability to which the failure of an institution is really not so much just the institution's problem, but becomes everyone's, and it's this systemic failure, domino effect kind of thing that we've seen through the collapse. How do you stem, or what prospects do you see, given all the realities that you put forth, for containing any risk-taking? I don't think anybody thinks we're going to go to, completely abolishing the markets or anything like that. How do you contain those system-wide collapse effects from individuals' failures?
Simon Johnson has written and spoken a great deal about this. There's debate about this question. Simon's view is very strongly that one thing that you have to do is break up the largest institutions currently in the financial system so that no single institution is in fact too big to fail. So that if you do begin to get a lot of bad behavior, then you can credibly say that you're going to let the first several institutions fail. And then there were clearly some holes in the laws. The holes have been plugged in the sense that it's now possible for the federal government to take over potentially any financial institution, whereas previously there were certain classes of financial institutions that could not be taken over by the federal government, at least, well, it could not be taken over by the federal government. There are many others. There's many other policy measures that can be taken and that are being widely debated. There is increasing agreement that higher capital levels are required. And to the credit of the economics discipline, many economists have been pushing for that, and there seems to be some movement in that direction. Yes, sir.
Okay, we'll take these final 2 or 3 questions. Could you please keep your questions short?
Sure. Here we are at the Engineering Systems Division, so my question is about systems. Almost none of the conversation that's about spending more or spending less is about systems. There's no attempt to get at root causes. There's no attempt to get at new efficiencies. There's no attempt to get at network effect efficiencies, which the Fed talks about. In fact, we're making more and more complex systems more and more complex, which is a great way to not be able to figure out how to clean things up and simplify. So here's the point. We had embedded reporters when we invaded overseas. We have citizens who actually are in banks and in the financial system who know when something odd happens. For example, friends called me up and said, I can't believe it, I came out of a meeting. We're getting rid of good loans and keeping the bad ones. Well, they knew that that would qualify them for unrestricted TARP funds. They also knew they could sit on the money as a bank and make very low-risk profits. So my question is, why aren't these things that lots of people seem to understand at the root level of hands-on work, why isn't that network of information being tapped? Why doesn't that become what we would call regulation or just being a good neighbor? Why doesn't Elizabeth Warren set it up so that people can provide anonymous tips going, something weird happened, it's not illegal, it's just weird, maybe it's part of a pattern? And why don't we look at outbreaks like this and have journalists and experts go, that could be this or that could be that. And if it's that, then it's unintended. And why don't we start to investigate that kind of thing? In other words, why aren't we canaries in the coal mine? Because we do live with the consequences. And many of us do work firsthand in the institutions we're talking about.
Well, there were a lot of questions there, and I'm...
It basically is, why don't we pay attention to information we can harvest quickly and easily instead of working with information that is part of the game?
Well, there are a lot of questions there. First of all, there were people who warned in an extremely public and explicit way about what was going on. But, you know, because of the forces that I tried to describe, they were not paid attention to. There is a separate interesting issue about the non-existence of global comprehensive information about the system. And that's something that several people have pointed out in a very sharp way. The most interesting and weird advocate of creating a global information system, a serious global information system, is Richard Fuld, who, in his congressional testimony after the collapse of his firm, said that that was the single most important thing that the federal government could do. There are other aspects of what you've said that are more complicated. You know, the whistleblowing, individual accountability, individual reporting thing. That's complicated, and you know, there again, the regulatory system in its prior state had a role in that, and we know that several people warned over a 5-year period of time that Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme, and we know that the SEC didn't pay attention to him. You know, and that's a relatively unconnected, unpowerful person. So,
thank you.
Keep your question short without commentary.
Okay. If there is such a tight and cozy duopoly at work here, my question is, in your opinion, why the hell did they not bail out Lehman?
The question is, if there's such a cozy duopoly, why was Lehman not bailed out? And okay, so I said when I was talking before that Lehman was a bit of a mystery, and aspects of the government's response during that period are a bit of a mystery. So let me give you a list of the explanations that people have offered about why Lehman wasn't bailed out. The one that Paulson himself offered was that there was no legal authority to do it. That's clearly baloney. But then there's, at certain points in semi-private conversations, he said, and other people around him have said, that the reason was moral hazard, that he wanted to make an example of Lehman because he wanted to show other people that they could not count on getting bailed out. That doesn't seem terribly plausible either. That may have been an element of it. You know, I don't totally discount that. Even if you do believe very, very strongly in the duopoly model theory, at a certain point you have to stop people from collapsing the entire system, and so if it's necessary to make an example of somebody, you know, you do so. But it's not a completely convincing explanation, not to me in any event. So, but there's like 5 others. So one of them is that Paulson simply didn't understand what Lehman's bankruptcy would do, and in fact we know that he didn't understand what Lehman's bankruptcy would do. Another one is most of the top management of Lehman Brothers, with one exception, a cousin of George W. Bush, everybody else in the top management of Lehman were Democrats. And So it was a partisan thing. That's another argument that people make. Another argument that people make is that Lehman had been gradually emerging as a serious challenger to Goldman's hegemony and dominance of the investment banking business, and that they wanted to put a stop to that. And another one is, and I think that this one has some credibility, is that they were just so goddamn overwhelmed that they didn't know what to do. And, you know, they just they couldn't get everything in line, and they were too confused. You know, you've got to remember, in 1 week previously, Paulson had taken over Fannie and Freddie, 1 week before. And that weekend, he was dealing simultaneously with the collapse of Merrill Lynch, AIG, and Lehman Brothers. And 2 or 3 days before, they had arranged or been involved with the sale of WAMU. Who bought WAMU? I've forgotten who bought WAMU. JP Morgan bought WAMU. And over that weekend, 25 different things were happening. You know, Morgan Stanley was very afraid that it was going to be next and was fighting very, very hard to prevent short selling that it argued was at the heart of the system. There have been allegations, not proven, that Goldman Sachs was, and several hedge funds were shorting Lehman and Merrill and contributed to their collapse. On the Friday before, JP Morgan impounded $5 billion of Lehman's money because it was afraid that Lehman wouldn't be able to pay its bills and or possibly wanted to cause Lehman's collapse. So, you know, you've got to understand that what was going on that weekend was not people making cool, rational, you know, distanced deliberations. But we don't know. We don't know. Okay.
Hi, Charles. Thank you again for yet another great film, following in the footsteps of No End in Sight. The question that I have actually is on, is there an end in sight with reference to the problems we've been discussing? Specifically, what you've done is laid out very persuasively today and in film a pattern of corruption, compounding, leveraging, and other problems with an effectively domestic end of the story in terms of the reforms that you've called for, reforms in political system. At the same time, we see these pathologies or problems emerging in many, many countries, with global imbalances accentuating, if you will, the problems that we observe in each of the national economies. So the no end in sight question, in a sense, is what changes or adjustments at the international level do you see as necessary to reduce the likelihood of similar disasters occurring in the future? Or has the disaster itself created an end to the problem in the sense that we won't make those mistakes in quite the same way?
I'm not very optimistic that the United States is going to be able to repeat making this kind of mistake in another 10 or 15 years. However, one thing that in my discussions and travels around the world, in part for making this film, made very clear is that America's days as regulatory, economic, and theoretical role model for the world are over. And India, China, Singapore, even Japan, as troubled as it is, you know, they are going their own way, and so I think that one thing that will at least prevent a truly global recurrence of this is simply that they've watched this in a sober way, and I think they've learned from it.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you all.